I look at the relationship between religion and resistance, religion and social justice activism in the history of Black people in the Americas, particularly the United States and Brazil. So I was very happy to see this film again. Some of you may know that it was shown on PBS some years ago, the series, but it's always good to be reminded. And I saw some wonderful commonalities between what was happening with folks in the North American colonies and what was happening with their brothers and sisters in Brazil and Cuba that I'd be happy to talk about at some point. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'd also like to, at this time, introduce Joel Odencourt. Joel, please join us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Joel.
My name is Joel Odencourt. I was born in Ghana. I'm of the Ga tribe. We are the people who live along the coast where the capital of Ghana, Accra, is. And maybe as we go, I'll go into a little more detail about the system and the environment of what we call Ghana today during this period that we saw. I'm an engineer by training, and I do IT and network engineering. I'm a manager, and I've worked with several large corporations, AT&T, US Western companies like that. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Joel. At this time, I'd like to reintroduce Reverend Quincy Shannon.
Greetings and salutations. My name is Reverend Quincy Shannon. Most just call me Q. I'm a Denver native. I had an opportunity to do graduate school at Virginia Union University, which was originally Lumpkin Slave Jail, which was a jail where they would keep slaves or the enslaved that originally gave them an opportunity for their freedom, and we were able to, within our school, go onto the plantations and do the slave walks. I'm particularly here to make the correlation between the transatlantic slave trade and what we have with our mass incarceration currently happening in the United States, and how slavery, how we looked at it in this amazing film, has not ended, and we still have individuals who are enslaved in the United States even today.
Excellent. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, our filmmaker and our guest of honor, Mr. Dante James. You want to say anything else?
Well, B introduced me.
Okay. We don't.
So I'd rather just take the time up and
All right.
for the panel.
Well, certainly, as I view the film, being a journalist, I've got a billion questions. I'll limit those to 4 or 5 so that we're not here until 2030 with one bathroom break. For the panel, if we're to accept the definitions of genocide and slavery, genocide being the extermination of a people and slavery being the exploitation of people, millions of Africans died in what we call the Middle Passage. How might you define or separate the notion of genocide and slavery given the fact that millions perished during the Middle Passage? Anybody?
Okay, I guess I'll take it first. When I read this question from Alfonso, I asked the question, if you go rob a bank, and in the process of that you kill somebody, will you charge only with bank robbery or you also charge with murder? So if your purpose is to capture people to sell them, but in the process, you killed a whole bunch of them, millions. I don't think you could be charged only with slave trade, because the process that you were engaged in had to do with only certain group of people, and that is genocide, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I think there's a very interesting reality when we think of like your intention and your outcome. And just because you go into something with the intention of making money doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be the money in which you make. So when we look at genocide from the definition that we have, geno meaning race or tribe, side meaning the killing, and we look at that being, okay, your race then goes to your killing and or your tribe becomes why you are killed. And then we look at the definition of slavery, which is the economics of keeping something so that you can profit off of it. Well, then the intention of it is to have something that you can make money off of. But the actual outcome that we have is then the oppression and then the killing of millions of people. So if the intent was just to make money, then we would have seen that there would have been humane ways to make sure that those who were enslaved were kept. But what we saw within the film was that, you know, they were allowed to go to certain islands so that they were able to be processed. We didn't even talk about the seasoning factor that happens before they even get to the United States. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade of looking at that triangle where many of them were actually taken to the Caribbean islands before they even made it into the United States so that they would be processed in such a way. So when we look at those things, I think that the genocide becomes the actual result of the slaves or those who were enslaved not acting or reacting in the way that they wanted them to, and thus makes them almost inseparable. Therefore, slavery and genocide, deductive reasoning, putting them together.
Thank you, Q. Dr. Hardy?
Essentially, I would agree with what's been said already, that in the circumstance of the enslavement of people of African descent in the Americas, which, as many of you recognize, was not just the British North American colonies, but the Portuguese colonies, the Spanish colonies, the French colonies, the Dutch colonies, so that we're talking about any place from 12 million at a low estimate to up to 20 million people. That experience, that business involved, as my colleagues have said, a great deal of death, a great deal of killing of millions of people. And so in that sense, I don't think it's helpful to try to separate out the experience of the enslavement of African people and their descendants from the experience of genocide. I think that they are linked, and it doesn't help us to try to make a distinction.
Thank you. Dante?
Well, I've been thinking about this, and I think my interpretation is in a larger context, because slavery was grounded in capitalist exploitation. And so for me, the question is capitalism genocidal? And I think that that question is relevant for slavery and relevant for today, because clearly there are homeless people who are homeless because of the need of corporate capitalists to make money off of housing. There are people all around the world who are dying from preventable and curable diseases as a result of the need for the pharmaceutical companies to make money off of their medications. So I think about it in a larger context and raise the question of whether or not capitalism is genocidal.
Thank you, Joel. I want to then jump very quickly, because I heard Q bring this up, and I want to give him an opportunity to express as well as the rest of the panel. this notion of the prison industrial complex as a system of neo-slavery that exists today, wherein it's simply slavery by another name, in my estimation. We have companies such as the Corrections Corporation of America, who is earning multi-billions of dollars, traded on the New York Stock Exchange. As of Friday, the stock closed at $15.71 a share. And I think this is a very interesting concept. And so I want to throw this question over to Q because he brought that up in his introduction. So talk to us, Q, on that, please.
So when we look at slavery or the enslavement that has happened here in the United States, what date would you say that it ended? Because we oftentimes are saying it as if it's stopped. And for me, that's a very interesting reality. When we look at the Emancipation Proclamation, it was very specific, the terms in which who was listed in that. And that wasn't all slaves. We were looking at the border states, and it was used as a political ploy to be able to get individuals to fight for a certain side, the Union, right? And if we go a little bit further than that and we look at the 13th Amendment, then we know that when you actually read through the 13th Amendment, there's a clause within the 13th Amendment that then states, unless you are convicted of a crime. Well, then we have to look at, well, how are people convicted of crimes in the United States? Well, we do realize that in impoverished areas, there is a higher rate or opportunity for you to be convicted of some type of criminal activity. So I know for myself, I fit many different descriptions. And that I drive down the street, I oftentimes get pulled over and I'm put into a system that is larger than myself. And I know this reality because I know that we used to have gang unit come into my neighborhood and they would beat us up and drop us off in other parts of Denver if we were not taken to jail. So I know individuals who are put into a system. So then if we know that to be true, then we start to look at, well, what laws are put in place? And how are those laws then put in place in certain areas? So we look at something easy like, okay, cocaine and crack, right? Both of them come from very similar components. One is just cooked, won't give you the process, don't want you to go to jail, right? But we understand that crack oftentimes was a certain demographic of individuals who used it, a poorer group, more or less minority, cocaine, a more affluent group, more so Caucasian. When you went to look at the laws in which how someone was criminalized behind the two things, if you were found with the same amount of either crack or cocaine, for crack, you could be in jail or imprisoned for 15 plus years, but for cocaine, it could be 5 or less. So we start to look at how, similar to in this film, that different laws are put in place for different people. Similarly, when we look at the plantations, that when plantations ended within the slavery's like stopping, many of those plantations didn't close, they just started working in other ways. So if you've ever been to Angola, which is a prison in Louisiana, those prisoners actually go outside and farm the work similar to what the enslaved would have done 200, 300 years ago. So it's very interesting when we start to look at the aspects of what has actually changed. And then when we start to look at, finally, just what's produced in prison. So do you guys know that there was a time when Victoria's Secret, they actually had some of their products being made within prisons? When Levi's jeans had a product that was made in jeans where it said, made on the inside to be worn on the outside. And we thought that that was, oh, made good because of the way that the product was being made, but it was made inside of prisons. So when we start to look at just the products coming out of our prisons, it's not just license plates that is how we've been like trained to believe. My school and my university, all of our furniture was made within the Missouri State Prison that was right down the street. All of it. There was an exclusive contract with the Missouri prison for all of the furniture that us as students slept on. So when we start to think of what is even produced within our prisons and how much of that is being profited upon, we start to realize that it's very profitable to keep individuals in our prison systems.
Thank you, Q. Anyone else on the prison industrial complex? I think he said it all. I was very interested in the film. This notion of the ability to sue sue the system for wages due. And I wanted to ask the panel, how does that inform your thoughts on the idea of reparations? Let's throw it open.
That's a really interesting question. When the series first came out and we were on the road promoting it, I was traveling with an absolutely brilliant historian by the name of Nell Painter. And she has since retired. But the question of reparations was raised, and Nell said, absolutely, black people are due reparations, and part of reparations should be a therapist for life because of the mental trauma that existed and the legacy of it that is still with us today.
I think sometimes we laughingly say in the African American community that PTSD does not stand for post-traumatic stress disorder, but rather stands for post-traumatic slavery disorder.
Yeah.
And these pains from all those years are still with us. And so I'll throw this question over to the rest of the panel on reparations.
Well, one thing that I'd like to add to that part of the conversation is actually a bit of encouragement that I have been seeing in the past year or two here in Denver and in other parts of the country and other parts of the hemisphere, where the sense that I'm getting, and I certainly would be interested in hearing when we get to the Q&A what you all's experience is, but the sense that I'm getting is that we are at a place in the history of our country where there is a moment of recognition that some kind of fundamental repair must be made for the extraordinary devastation and indeed the sickness upon which the country was founded. Those of you who are from Denver and who listen to NPR may remember early in the year, there was a segment that featured a couple of white Denver women who have separately dedicated themselves and their resources to providing reparations for African American organizations and even for individuals. There's one woman in particular who has a website, Reparations for, the number 4, Slavery. I think it's .org, but it may be .com. But there is also an organization that has actually more like a study group of people here in Denver of a variety of races. They're Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans, white folks who are coming together to study what does reparations mean in the 21st century and what can people who are living in Denver actually do on both individual and institutional levels. Some of you may know that in other parts of the hemisphere, in Brazil, for example, there are communities and movements that have been pushing for some significant meaning of reparations in those contexts as well, because as I said, slavery and its aftermath of racial discrimination and the disenfranchisement of black people has happened all over the hemisphere. We're not just talking about the United States. And there are other parts of the Americas where people are looking at what does that mean and what does it take to really repair. And I was so happy that my brother Dante raised the question with us about the role of the economic systems under which we live in this extraordinarily damaging experience of human society that we have created. And as human beings, we are capable of creating something else. That's what gives me encouragement, that people are looking at what can we do differently? What can we do that makes some meaningful repair and that allows us to become a different kind of society?
Yeah, I would jump in and say that reparations is a joke in the United States. Because by definition, reparations means making an amends for a wrong and then paying out dues. And we have a selective amnesia within our country that has made it hard for us to make amends of the wrong that has been done, for us to even talk about paying the dues. Oftentimes when we think about reparations, we think about the monetized aspect of it. But it's actually acknowledging that slavery happened. And if we think about it, there are certain places right now that are teaching in our history books that slavery did not happen, right? And we looked at the film, and one of the things that really caught me by, it was just eye-opening, is that there was a period of slavery that happened in the United States longer than a period that many of us have been free in the United States. So if that is there true, but we have history books teaching that slavery didn't exist or slavery did not happen, how can we make amends of something that we have not even come to terms has existed? In the same sense that when you go, like I lived in Virginia, and I used to go to some of the plantations and do the slave walks, and there's a place there called Daughters of the Confederacy. And it's a building that when I walked in, they looked very surprised. And there's a time in Virginia where every museum is free. So I decided to go to the Daughters of the Confederacy the day that it was free because I didn't want to pay to go. And when I walked in, the lady said, "Oh, we don't get any of your kind here." And I said, "Oh, that's unique. You don't get a lot of students." Well, I would love to just be here for a while to like walk around. And they had the original Stonewall Jackson battle flag of the Confederacy in that building. And as I looked and read what was written on the walls, I realized that they are crazy because the history in which they are repeating or saying, even in that building, does not match the history in which actually happened in the United States. So until we are able to come to terms that slavery happened, it's not a myth, it's not something that we think happened, it's not something that kind of sort of happened. No, slavery is a reality in which the United States was built off of. And until we as a country can come to terms that it happened, we have to then apologize for it happening and then come to terms with not recreating it each and every day within our system. Until that happens, there is no opportunity for us to have reparations because by definition, there's no way for it to happen.
Thank you, Q. Joel? Thanks.
I would just like to add a few things to this because for me, I'll speak for myself. I had to leave Africa, come here and go back before I realized the meaning of slavery and what it has done. I took my two children back home for them to experience traditional things, festivals and all this. And I took them to Elmina. That is where one of the main slave ports were. And I have been there many, many times when I lived there. But for the first time, I saw the chains on the wall, the point of no return, and where the governors used to live, and they look down at the slaves, and when they see a slave woman that they like, they had them brought up, showered, take advantage of them, and if they are lucky, and they were found pregnant before the ships come, they will release them into their community, the tribal community, even though the people didn't come from there. So today, when you go there, you can tell there are a lot of light-skinned people in Elmina and all those people. That's where that generation came from. And then I stood there, and for the first time, I saw the evilness of slavery. Because I could see that people going there, some of them could be my ancestral people that went through there. So when we talk about reparation, I look at it totally differently. For us, we just don't look at the people who are alive today. We go back in ancestry. So when we talk about reparations, I'm looking at the 10 or so million people who were buried in the oceans. And there are generations that have been lost. So I don't know what kind of reparation will satisfy a person like me. Because I'm looking at our ancestors, so I'm looking at generations after them and what they could have achieved. So reparations to me has to be defined in a different way than just money, because for us it's more than just money.
Dante, go right ahead, please.
One of the things that people opposed to reparations say is, how can it happen? What form would it take? And that's a valid question, but I think that we have a beginning in terms of an answer. If you go and get Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, and the whole name of the book is The Debt, What America Owes Black Americans. That can serve as a point of departure in terms of figuring out how this can actually happen. It's not a question of whether or not it should, but it's a point of departure to figure out how it can actually happen.
Thank you, Dante. How many people need to die in order for it to be qualified as a genocide? And as I thought about that, I was thinking about the killings and the lynchings that occurred throughout the nation from 1619 to 1865 or beyond, or 1965 for that matter. And does that qualify as a genocide? Panel. Don't all speak at the same, okay.
What do you think, since it's
Well,
your question?
Yeah. I think
Go ahead, Joe.
I think the classic definition of genocide is when you target a certain particular group of people and the intention is to wipe them out completely. Now that has never happened in history. You can kill a whole bunch of them, but you are never able to kill all of them. And so the numbers are not really the issue. The intent, and we look at slavery sometimes where we say, well, it was an economic thing, so the killings and the dying were just an offshoot. But it only happens to a certain group of people, and a huge number happened. So if you are running an economic system and you can get the labor you need anytime you want, then you don't care whether you kill them or not. And that's genocide. So the numbers really don't, you can't go just by, because there are some people who have been killed, maybe 1.2 million people have been killed is considered genocide. And when you look at transatlantic slave trade, where up to almost 20 million people have been killed, there should be no question and some argument about whether it's genocide or not genocide, no matter what the intent was.
Thank you very much, Ken.
So to repeat the question, it was how many people have to die for it to be considered genocide? And I think that means that we have to recognize that there were people that died. And sadly, that's not always the case, right? When we look at the 3/5 compromise, which is often talked about wrongly, right? For every 3 white persons, it equaled 5 slaves. That would equal for taxation purposes, which means 2 people weren't counted as people while we were doing the taxation side of things, right? Taxation without representation. And that same history then continues on, where many people are viewed invisible in our society, so much so that even their killing and or deaths are wiped out as not happening. So that we say Black Lives Matter in 2019, and some people are acting like that's a very revolutionary statement. All we're saying is, look at me, I exist, I'm here, and what's happening to people who look like me matters. And for some, that is worse than saying some crazy statements, because saying that Black Lives Matter then has to say that my life then matters, that if somebody does something to me, that matters. And so to say how many people have to die for it to be considered a genocide, my answer is, I need you to see me as a person. I need you to see people who look like me as people. So then my life then matters to you in a state that my life then, if it's taken, it is a genocide. But until you can acknowledge that I am a person, that people who look like me exist, that Black lives do indeed matter, then we will never be able to get to a state of being able to say how many of us have to die for a genocide, because every day I walk out of my door not knowing if I'm going to make it home.
Thank you, Q. Dante, please.
Well, I'd like to add that I think it's, in the context of contemporary society, the numbers matter, but equally important are the genocidal policies. The genocidal policies of the criminal justice system, the genocidal policies of a substandard education system, the genocidal policies of inadequate health care. So I think that clearly the numbers matter, but in terms of moving forward, in terms of defining genocide, I would like to see us think about expanding the parameters of the discourse and the definition beyond just numbers, and look at real life policies that are in fact genocidal to specific populations, and the specific populations that I'm speaking to are Black people, and in particular, Black men. Black men, if you look at any statistical analysis in terms of education, the criminal justice system, health statistics and whatnot, we are the target. And those genocidal policies, I think we would be remiss if we don't look at them and try to make some adjustments in them.
Thank you very much. Dr. Harding, would you like to?
You know, I don't have anything else to add about the piece on genocide. I stand very much in support of what you have already heard. I do want to just say a little something about spirituality and religion in relationship to the film, and in relationship to Black people, and how we have survived as well as we have, if I may put it that way. One of the scholars that Dante interviewed, I'm forgetting precisely which one it was, but one of them was talking towards the end about the role of religion and spirituality in helping Africans and their descendants enslaved in the Americas hold on to a sense of their humanity, hold on to a sense of their dignity, and also he used the phrase fusing them into a new identity as African Americans. Because this is what I study, Afro-Atlantic religions, and because I pay a lot of attention to Brazil and Cuba, one of the things that was so interesting to me was to see that formation of the ring shout that you may have recognized, the enslaved people who were dancing in a counterclockwise circle. That formation, the circle dance, is a central and sacred formation all over the continent of Africa and all over the Afro-Atlantic world. And it's a formation that's used to connect the living people with ancestral forces and with the sense of possibility for those who are coming afterwards. And so while all of that, some of it is more implied than explicated in the film, I want to say that as we talk about what it is that is necessary, both for African Americans and for our larger society, if we are going to survive into the 21st and 22nd centuries, I think it's very important for us to look at those ancestral resources that have held us and strengthened us and enabled us to hold on to a vision that is beyond the limitation that the society puts upon us, and to look at how that vision can be healing, can be transformative for the society as a whole. So what I'm saying is that there is something in Black religion, there is something in the ancestral traditions, the African traditions, and in what those enslaved people did to remake the Christianity that was forced upon them, to remake it into a more liberatory religion, that there's something in that that is important for us and that is powerful for not only African Americans, but for the nation as a whole. And so we should pay some attention to the role of spirituality as we talk about reparation, as we talk about transformation, as we talk about what it means to be a healthy multiracial democracy.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. At this point, we're going to turn it over to you for Q&A, and we would certainly like to get a bit of your input. So do we have microphones throughout the audience? Okay, all right. So please, by all means, I think there's a question back here. This gentleman.
Both in the documentary and the panel, you discussed the transformation of freedom and slavery throughout this country's history, from the indentured servitude to the slavery to, our current prison industrial complex. But what do you guys feel about the transformation of the right to vote, from where initially there was no right to vote, then we had a right to vote, and the Jim Crow era grew to resist that. We had to fight for the Civil Rights Act, and since then, through the Electoral College, gerrymandering, and redlining, they've used that to evolve it to where we really don't have a full right to vote. And what do you feel about that, and what input do you have on that?
Is that to a particular individual? Is that
Is
to
that
me
to-
or a particular individual?
Is it just to the panel in general, or is that? Okay, good. Anybody want to take that?
You can start. Well, in terms of the right to vote, clearly that is something that is sacred, not only to our experience as Black people, but sacred and essential to American democracy. But it's unfortunate that we've evolved to the point where it's more than just the right to vote, it's the right to have your vote counted, and to make sure that gerrymandering of districts and voting on a larger structural platform is in place. So I think that, and that's also something that it is incumbent upon American citizenry to demand. This democracy, if it's going to work, it has to be a participatory democracy. And we have to make demands of the people who are in Washington, D.C. to serve our needs. And right now we have a situation where Many of them are very confused about,
Say the least.
about what they're there for and who they're there to serve. So, and I think that we have to demand that they do what we sent them to do, and that they fix the kind of structural impediments to your vote meaning something that exist in many jurisdictions.
Thank you, Dante. Right ahead.
Thank you for your question. I would say the right to vote has been essential for a number of years for us obtaining levels of freedom that we have been able to achieve in the yet-to-be United States, right? When we look at the film and we were able to see different individuals who were able to use the law to then be able to obtain versions of freedom regardless of the timeline of how long they were able to keep it, it was then that right to vote that has often been able to influence or help those laws go into place. I think the hard reality that we have to come to terms with is that we often claim that we're a democracy. And when we start to look a little bit more at how our voting system is done, especially on the national level, it seems more of a corporatocracy where we have corporations who are able to buy and or work on votes in certain ways. So to answer or to attempt to answer your question, I think, yes, the right to vote is important, and we want to continue to make sure those individuals who don't have it, so when we start to think about the prison industrial complex and how certain states still are denying certain individuals who either have felonies the right to vote or different realities in different states, we want to keep pushing for the right to vote. But I think we need to take a really hard look at what the Electoral College looks like. And what that representation is then like. And if we're going to continue to have different groups that are going to be a part of the United States, like Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, American Virgin Islands, we also have to look at what does that then look like for their voting status. And we have individuals who then are counted as a part of pieces of like how we work the United States, but their votes are oftentimes not included in what we're voting for within the United States.
Well, the fact that a young guy who looks like a millennial, I think, would pose a query about gerrymandering and redlining and prison industrial complex, for me, only crystallizes the fact that we walk around looking free, and yet we still are not. So I think conversations like this and engaging young people like this young man must continue. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, below us.
I'd like to know about what percentage of prisons are privately owned and who owns them? Is it like a person or is it a committee, a group, a company? And why we even have privately owned prisons?
I've been asking that question for a long time. And as far as I understand it, entities like states, for example, contract with a company like Corrections Corporation of America, not only to build these facilities, but to manage them. And as I mentioned earlier, they are making multi-billions of dollars and actually trading on Wall Street, which boggles my mind. And today, they have 16,750 slave masters and overseers, which is outrageous in 2019. So primarily, and I'm sure there are others, Velois, of these kinds of corporations, but this one, CCC, is the largest of those. And states are actually contracting for the service, which then means, certainly, as a business owner, I'm bottom line driven. And therefore, if I owned a prison, I'm going to keep you in here as long as I possibly can in order to continue to make money off your residence in this facility, which seems completely counterintuitive to what we ought to be doing.
Just a quick Google search. I can tell you for Colorado, we currently have 7 that are for-profit prisons in Colorado. And that's on like this federal level, and then on the state level, there's 3 for-profit prisons, just from a quick Google search of what I was able to find. But on a national level, that number then, it depends on which state. Not all states do have private or privatized prisons. But then on the separate level, the corporations, as it was said by Alfonso, were both being traded on the stock market, which is a very big reality. But then even if a prison isn't privatized, some of the work that is done within the prison can then be contracted out. And then those prisons are leased, for a lack of a better word, out to different entities. So you can even have federally or state-run prisons that are not for-profit prisons that also are able to lease out prisoners that are then doing work within a company or a corporation, which is also problematic when we talk about it in the terms of slavery or enslavement.
Thank you. I think this young lady here, oh, no, here, this young lady here had a question, and then we'll go to, oh, okay, we'll get to you guys, I'm sorry. We'll get over there next.
This question is directly to Q, because one of the things you mentioned was Columbus and the Columbus type history. And for the last 30 years, the Colorado American Indian movement has been trying to get rid of Columbus Day, and some of my friends and I also went down to testify to get rid of Columbus Day. And I think we need a broader coalition, and someone like you who's an educator would be a great ally to come and bring folks to testify to get rid of Columbus Day.
Yeah, I would love to be a part of that. Talk to me offline and we can find ways to do it. I'm thankful within the school that I work in, our social studies teachers were able to get together, and they actually are teaching a true history within like Columbus's aspect within how he worked within both Mexico, the Caribbean islands, and both the United States, to be able to give our students a little bit better or a more truthful picture of who Columbus was and not just some of the myths that have been said. But I think it's very important as we're thinking of the wide reach in which Columbus Day and or the Columbus holidays and or just saying Columbus has done all of these great, amazing things, and then we start to find out who Columbus really was. So after we can talk, and I would love to figure out ways to join the coalition.
Perfect. Thank you, Q. I'd like to move to this side for a question, and I know that there was a hand. Pardon me, because the light is in my eye. The young man back here in the back. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss somebody? Oh, okay, okay.
Denied.
We'll get you, man. Don't worry about it. Sorry about that.
Quick couple of questions. First, I want to comment on the question that started it, right? Genocide versus slavery. To me, I worry that by blurring some things, we need to have clear lines here. I think genocide, the objective is to wipe out a people. And I think, when I think about slavery, we were exploiting a people. Yes, the intent was to, some people, a large number, maybe a very large percentage, I think someone said a third, died on the passage. Okay, I get that. At the same time, they were trying to grow a labor force, right? And so we see slave owners in a mode where if I can get this child born too, I have a labor for many, many years. But they're not trying to wipe the people out. And then when I compare that today with the prison complex, I get concerned, again, blurring the lines. What we're experiencing today is oppression. All right? They're trying to kill us per se, but to oppress a people. And they're doing that less so, I'm less concerned about who is profiting from the prison. As I understand, there's a movement toward trying to reduce government costs and that, and they may do it more efficiently as to the reason you are being imprisoned. And that's where I think the laws and are structured in such a way where they do take advantage. They are not colorblind. They are making a distinction between cocaine and crack, as an example that you used. And I think understanding that there's a difference here allows us to put together different strategies. So I get concerned when we start to blur those lines a bit.
So what's your question, sir?
So my question is when I look at religion in this aspect, I remember studying as a child in high school or whatever, that there was a role that religion played in the very early stages. I think the film talked about it, about in the sense that many of the slaves were trying to use Christianity as a way to obtain freedom. And I thought, I seem to recall, maybe you guys would know, that very early on in the stages, they decided, well, the Native Americans that were over here could not be enslaved. And that there was a decision made, letter went out, I seem to recall from Roman Catholic Church saying that you can go ahead and enslave these black people, kind of sanctioning by the church for slavery early on. Is that true?
You're talking about Bartolomé de las Casas, probably, who was a Spanish priest.
Amazing
who
Grace.
was very, very concerned about the treatment of indigenous people. This is talking about like the 16th century. And yes, so initially the attempts in all parts of the Americas were to enslave native people, to enslave indigenous people. And indigenous people were enslaved in many places. But for a variety of reasons, some of which had to do that this was their land, they knew the topography and the geography well, their numbers and their capacities to organize themselves to resist and to leave the areas where they were attempted to be enslaved. There were a variety of reasons for which Native American, the enslavement of Native Americans was then transitioned into the enslavement of Africans. But a major part of that had to do with the fact that Europeans were involving themselves in this trade in human beings, and as Dante's film demonstrates in the U.S. context, and it happened in different ways in other parts of the Americas, you get this experience by the 17th century where Africans, black people, are the primary folks who are being commodified, whose labor and whose bodies are being commodified to support the establishment, basically, of the modern world as we know it, in terms of the economies and the political structure of the modern world. So this happened in different kind of ways in different parts of the Americas, but it's a story that you see repeated. And yes, Christianity was very much a part of the legitimization of the enslavement of people of African descent. And the point that I was making is one that I think you see when you look at the engagement of indigenous people with Christianity. It's interesting, you can even see it in some cases with Islam too, but certainly with Christianity, you see this in the case of Africans, you see it in the case of indigenous people, who had been, where the religion was imposed on these folks as a way of colonizing them, actually take and use indigenous resources, ancestral resources, to transform that religion. So the religion that we know as Black Christianity, as African American Christianity, has these resources of ancestral wisdom that were not given by the slaveholders, and that came as much from an African meaning of the world and an African understanding of our relationship to our ancestors, our relationship to the natural world, the right of every living being to have freedom. Those things came from African indigenous understandings of the world, not from a Bible that says slaves obey your masters. But Black people took that Christianity and made it a liberatory, a compassionate, a kind of Christianity that then by the time you get to 1955 and 1960 is a Christianity that helps to offer a liberatory vision for the whole society. And my point is that there are indigenous and African meanings of religion in that have sustained us and that we need to remember and to hold on to.
Thank you very much.
Can
I want to take your class.
Can I just say something quickly? Just it would be like
we're
3
gonna,
seconds.
Hold on one sec, Q. We're going to take 2 more questions. I believe there was a woman here on this side. Yes, this lady and the young man in the back. And we've got time for 2 more questions. Go ahead, Q.
I would just say in terms of the blurring lines comment at the beginning is that oftentimes many of those lines were then blurred when we start to look at like the Haitian Revolution. in Haiti as a particular country then got demonized to a point where those people were then put in a sense of a genocide. And we start to look at the lynchings that happen throughout even up to now where there's people still being killed. Those lynchings then also are a form of genocide for me. So I would say I don't intentionally blur the lines, but I think the more that I study history, I see that they're not coloring in the coloring book where we're actually staying in the lines. And afterwards, I would love to talk a little bit more with you about what I mean as far as some more information.
Thank you, Q. Yes, ma'am. Right here, and then the young
Dante, we've got, I'm sorry, time for one more question.
One more question. Sorry, my man.
And I'll just before that question, we do have time for you to mingle with the panelists, and we have a wonderful reception over here. But more importantly is that this is a teaser. 2020, we're going to be doing a day or 2-day conference on this issue. Excuse me for interrupting.
Thank you,
but
Roz.
go ahead and take the last question.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Yes, ma'am. Yep, here comes the mic.
Hello, I just want to thank you all for your time and for bringing this to us here today. You know, in terms of the prison industrial complex, I received a text from my Arapahoe County Sheriff the other day asking me to vote yes on 1A. Let's build a safe, modern jail facility that protects our quality of life. And I thought, wow, okay, whose quality of life? Not brown and black folks, right? Let's build a bigger jail, really? That's what we need to spend our tax dollars on? I don't think so. But it is tricky because they put in that they're gonna spend some money on mental health services and on even alternative sentencing programs and programs to reduce recidivism. So that's important. And yet it's an incredibly expensive project to build a much larger prison when I think we should be working on reducing the number of people being imprisoned in the first place. So, but the way that it's phrased, be careful. Like, we have to be really thoughtful voters in thinking these things through, and my gut is saying, I don't want to pay for another prison. And yet the people are suffering that are in those jails, right? They're being held in facilities that are overcrowded, and maybe they don't have money for programming that can help them get out. So I don't know if anybody can speak to that, but I'm very troubled. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And not only that, exploited for their free labor. Anybody?
I was just Googling what 1A was to give me a better understanding of it.
Okay.
I've read one side and I'm looking at the other side. I don't have enough information to give the right answer because I see both sides as I'm reading, but I do agree with the language of it, of looking at it as saying, you know, population in prisons is the issue and we're gonna do this to then decrease the population within the prisons as like the tagline. And as I'm looking at both sides and the money that it's spending, I would also agree that it's probably problematic to look at, but I would like to get more information before giving a quantified answer.
Well, that concludes our panel discussion. I'm supposed to say something to close it out, but I'm going to forego that in the interest of time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention and your time today. Have one more round of applause for our man of the hour, Dante James.